Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and welcome to our very first module of our online access control crash course. Today we'll be zoning in on credential and reader technologies. Before we get started, I just want to mention that the goal of this course is to equip system integrators with the tools and resources necessary to confidently guide your customers through their access control purchase journey. So you may be new to the world of access control, and so this course will really help give you a solid foundation of the product line. For more advanced integrators, I still note that we'll start off at a high level, but we'll eventually get into more detail throughout this very course. So since we have a lot of material to cover, let's get right into it. So what to expect over the next 6 weeks? We have a lot of content to cover throughout this crash course. It's been divided into 6 modules. Modules 1 to 4 are for more of the advanced system, the more beginner system integrators. It sort of covers a good foundation of credential technology to controllers and electronic locks and other door hardware and accessories. And finally, we touch into access control software. Eventually, then we get into more advanced topics like designing, managing, and migrating access control best practices, along with this workflow-based approach to managing access. So we try to cater to all ends of the spectrum. Note that after the crash course, we'll have a final exam being sent to all participants. Participants will require an 80% or higher in order to pass the final exam. One thing that I do want to mention is that questions are welcome. Please ask your questions using the question dialog box located at the right-hand side of your screen. Note that a brief Q&A period will follow after the session. So I'd like to introduce myself. My name is Derek Arcuri. I'm the Product Marketing Manager at Genetec with a focus in access control. And I'm joined by François Brouillet, the Commercial Manager at Genetec, again with a focus on access control. And in order for you to get the best experience throughout the next several weeks, please join our LinkedIn group to ask questions, to share material, and to collaborate with classmates. The sign-up link is available in the presentation that'll be made available in the next few days. It's also included in every automated email going out to all registrants. Note that Francois and myself will be monitoring this group to answer all questions. So what will you walk away with after this 1-hour module? You'll walk away with an understanding of common card and reader technologies. We'll learn about card formats, card serial numbers, and ultimately we want you guys to guide your customers towards advanced credentials like biometrics or mobile credentials. We want to help you guys help customers spot card and reader vulnerabilities and then guide them towards a more secure alternative. So we'll be talking about emerging threats throughout this module. And finally, we want to help you guys confidently guide customers through their credential migration. So I'd like to start off every module with this slide as it gauges where in the architecture we'll be focusing on. Now, in a typical architecture, we have our client and workstation that consists of the directory and the access manager. The directory is essentially responsible for configuration, the client execution, the audit trails, whereas the access manager is the command and control of the controllers and the access event storage in SQL. So it's really the access control database. Then if we go further downstream, our controllers saves the access control settings, the database and access rules locally, and ultimately makes the access control decision. The input-output module presents the inputs to the controller, and the controller essentially tells the I/O module which output is needed. And finally, we have our door hardware, including the request to exit, the door contacts, the door strike, and the reader. Today, of course, we're focusing our attention on the cards and readers. So let's first look at different forms of credentials and readers, and we'll look at which credentials are expected to grow and shrink in sales as we look into the future. So right off the bat, credentials are way more than just cards. They're something that validates your identity. Now, this typically includes something you have, like an access card or ID, something you know, like a PIN code or password, and something you are, like a biometric identification, like your iris or thumbprint. Evidently, when you combine different forms of credentials, the host becomes more certain of the identity as it becomes more challenging to impersonate an identity, given the more factors that are required to authenticate. Now, multi-factor authentication, or MFA, requires more than one method of authentication from these independent categories of credentials to verify the credential holder's identity. Now, this can be card and PIN, it can be card plus PIN plus biometric, but which form of credential is more popular in access control? We'll examine that on our next slide. So at one point, magstripe and barcode cards and readers used to dominate the credential and reader market. But with changes in compliance, functionality, and security, many companies have already transitioned existing magstripe systems to proximity cards or new generation of smart card access control systems. So newer credential types include contactless cards, mobile credentials, and biometrics. Note that multi-technology cards or readers do exist to help your customers transition over to newer technology from older to a more secure alternative. So we'll talk more about card and reader migrations later on in this module. At this point, I just want to introduce the common credential types. So now that we know which are the older credential types and which are the newer credential types, let's take a look at the credential adoption expectations over the next several years. So right off the bat, as you can expect, the magstripe cards are in steep decline from 2016 to 2021. This is an IHS market forecast. So 125 kilohertz prox cards, which is a vulnerable credential technology, is in decline, but today represents the biggest share of adoption. IHS Markit expects 13.56 megahertz smart cards, which is the more secure alternative to the 125 kilohertz prox card, to grow at 9% compound annual growth rate, representing 91 million US dollars worth of cards, essentially equating the same amount of volume of US dollars as the 125 kilohertz cards. Now, if you're very fresh to the world of access control, you may already be overwhelmed with the terminology that I'm throwing out there. But don't worry, as we'll be covering all of these different technologies very soon. All you should take away right now from this slide is that magstripes and 125 kilohertz cards are declining and smart cards are increasing. You'll also notice that mobile credentials will be growing at a whopping 116%. The reason for the strong growth is twofold. The market sentiment believes that, as in other industries, mobile credentials in access control is not only a strong value proposition by itself, but mobile credentials also has the ability to unlock a more integrated and better value system for your end users, while also allowing providers new avenues of service that can support revenue streams going forward. In addition, mobile credentials are not competing against the traditional physical card market at this time, and therefore have a potential market equal to that of smart cards. So now that you have a feel for how the credential market will evolve, let's look at how credentials and readers, or how cards in general and readers work. So over the next few slides, we'll learn how cards and readers work and how their relationship really matters. So all a card does is store a set of binary numbers, essentially ones and zeros, that the reader decodes, passes that number up to the controller to associate with a card holder. But on this slide, I want to focus your attention on how each credential communicates with the reader. Now, Passive RFID requires no battery. The data on the card is energized when presented in proximity to a reader, and through what we call resonant energy transfer, the reader charges the card, and the card then broadcasts the credential for the reader to interpret and pass up to the controller for an access control decision. Active RFID systems use battery-powered RFID tags that continuously broadcast their own signal. Active RFID tags are commonly used as beacons to accurately track the real-time location of assets or in high-speed environments such as tolling. Active tags provide a much longer read range than passive tags, but are also more expensive. And mobile credentials communicate with the reader over either near-field communication, or NFC, or Bluetooth Low Energy, or BLE. Now for BLE, the reader must have a Bluetooth module behind the reader, or there must be a Bluetooth component in the reader in order to establish communication with the smartphone. When the application on the smartphone is launched, whether it's in the background or the foreground, the credential holder will usually gesture in order to show intent to authenticate. Then it establishes connection with the Bluetooth receiver, and the app will securely broadcast the credential out for the reader to decode and to pass up to the controller. Contact credentials like magstripe and chip cards are less convenient for access control applications. Magstripe adoption is declining, of course, but the chip card that we see in credit card applications are very secure. Unfortunately, not exactly convenient to insert a chip card into a reader in order to gain access to an area. It just simply takes too long to authenticate, so we haven't seen a big adoption in the access control world relative to other credentials that we're covering today. Some verticals have adopted the smart chip, like in government, but we don't usually see it in other verticals. Now, we know that the card is energized when presented in proximity to a reader. Through resonant energy transfer, the reader charges the coils in the card, giving the energy to broadcast the credential for the reader to interpret. Then the reader might decrypt the information sent over the air and pass the information in binary form over to the controller for an access control decision. Now, in the case of the transparent reader, the controller would decrypt the information in the card. If you have any questions about transparent readers, come ask myself or Francois, and we can follow up during the Q&A session after this module. Recall that mobile credentials that communicate over Bluetooth require that the reader have a Bluetooth component in order to establish connection with the smartphone. So when the application on the smartphone that's launched in the background or the foreground, the credential holder will typically gesture. When it establishes connection with the Bluetooth receiver, which then initializes a handshake with the reader to request the credential from the application. The reader will then pass up the information to the controller and then makes its access control decision. Biometric readers work a little differently. Let's use the example of a thumbprint as a biometric credential. So when a thumbprint is presented, the reader compares it to a template that is either stored on the reader, on the server, or compared to the template that is stored on the cardholder's smart card. For the Europeans on the webinar today, note that storing the biometric template on the reader is not allowed in certain European countries. Once the reader matches the thumbprint to the template, it finds the associated credential information, passes up the number to the controller in Wiegand format for an access control decision. So, with all of these different technologies that we're talking about comes a very important topic to keep in mind. The card-to-reader relationship is super important to keep in mind as you're guiding your customers through a card and reader purchase journey. purchase decision rather. The reader must be compatible with the card and vice versa. So that's magstripe cards with magstripe readers, the 125 kilohertz proximity cards with 125 kilohertz proximity readers, MyFair DeskFire contactless smart cards with MyFair readers, HID iClass with HID iClass readers. HID, just off the bat, HID is a technology that dominates the Americas market. MyFair DeskFire EV1 credentials sort of dominate EMEA, so Europe, the Middle East, Africa, and parts of Asia. So multi-tech readers or multi-tech credentials allows your customers to leverage more than one technology. Think of it similar to a two-in-one digital scanner and fax machine. An office employee can send faxes to a recipient or recipients that were not equipped with email at the time, or also send emails to the more advanced recipients. Similarly, multi-tech readers can read different credential technologies, or multi-tech cards can broadcast its credential on different reader technologies. Now, at the end of this module, we'll discuss card migration strategies possible with multi-tech readers or cards. But for now, I just want to spend time examining the data on the card. So over the next few slides, I'll walk through card format and explain what a card serial number is. But first, I'd like to ask the audience what this number means to you. What does this number mean to you? Now, your brain is working to make sense of this number. All right? The answer is that this number is my work phone number. Now, knowing that it's a telephone number makes sense of the data and allows you to decode the data. The first number is, of course, the country code. The next three are the area code. And the last 7 are traced to the Genetec head office. And if you enter the extension cord, it'll be traced to my phone at my desk here. Now, I use this metaphor to explain what a card format is. So a card format describes what a number means or how the number is used, like how the phone number is laid out. The format is not the number itself. So the card format is comprised of fields that can include one or more of the following, including the facility code and card number, the company code, the site code, or the issue code. All specific card formats are identical in both 125 kHz proximity and 13.56 MHz cards. This ensures that any controller capable of understanding data from 125 kHz cards and readers will also seamlessly work with 13.56 MHz cards and readers. Now, when you receive a copy of this presentation, click the link below on this slide to learn more about card formats. We're just going to keep breezing by. So the card format describes how the data is organized on the card. Now, for some systems, the card doesn't know its format, nor does the reader. Only the controller or software interprets the format. On the next slide, we'll talk about different card formats, but first I want to run through an example of how credential data is in binary form is organized on a card. So we have the part in green that represents the facility code assigned to the customer's organization, and then the blue portion represents the actual card number. The card format should only be needed for credential import or to visualize the card information in the reports. Now, a controller that would grant access on a subset of credential information, for example, only on the facility code, would reduce the assurance level of that credential. Then we have our parity bits, which is essentially an error checking mechanism ensuring that the card number received has not been altered by any external interference. So there are several common card formats. Others are controlled, and your customers can even define a custom card format. The very popular standard 26-bit Wiegand format is an example of an open format. It has 255 possible facility codes, and there can be up to 65,535 card ID numbers per facility code. So that represents a total number of cards that can be used in its entire range without any duplication is about 16.7 million. The moment you go after 16.7 million, there's a risk of overlapping. So there are no restrictions on the use of this format. It is not documented by HID Global, and HID does not restrict duplication of card numbers. That means that there are bound to be duplicate cards out there. Now, vulnerable or not worth the risk, that's really up to your customer. HID also produces and manages over 1,000 other card data formats, but all of them share the same fundamental concept as the 26-bit format. Other card manufacturers also have unique controlled formats. So if we take an example that includes the Corporate 1000, the Corporate 1000, this is essentially from HID. It offers a unique card format program where your end user, your customer, owns the unique format, and HID Global guarantees that the customer's format will not be duplicated. Additionally, the customer must provide written authorization to HID for their integrator or distributor to be able to purchase the specified Corporate 1000 cards from HID. So this gives your customer absolute control over the manufacturing, the distribution, and delivery of their specific cards. Something you should note about Corporate 1000, your customer's access control panels must be capable of decoding the Corporate 1000 format, and HID currently manages several hundred unique Corporate 1000 formats, and many more are still readily available. Other card formats include the H10306 34-bit and 37-bit that are similar to the standard 26-bit that we covered earlier on, but contain more bits, so more variety and possible card numbers, reducing the chance of overlapping. Now, we talk about overlapping. Let me give you a real-life example of a shortfall with the standard 26-bit Wiegand format between a courthouse and police department. So both the police department and the courthouse had overlapping cards. They didn't know it, but they had overlapping cards because there's only so many card possibilities with that 26-bit format. When they determined that one police officer was able to access a sensitive area that only a judge had access to, they realized that it was due to an overlapping card number. Now, the odds of this happening are fairly low, but still possible. The courthouse then swiftly moved over to Corporate 1000. Note that your customers can also define their custom card format themselves if they want to take advantage of the advantages of HID Corporate 1000 without having to work specifically with HID. Now, I want to glance over a subject that I find very important as it leads to some confusion in the market. CSN. CSN stands for Card Serial Number and is the unique card serial number of a contactless smart card that has been developed specifically as per ISO specifications as an anti-collision mechanism to uniquely identify a card when more than one card is presented at a reader at the same time. So it provides the ability to communicate with several contactless smart cards simultaneously. Think of the CSN as a house number. It's used to identify the card, and everybody needs to be able to see it so it can be read without any security or authentication. That said, the CSN is not secure. It's available for everyone. It doesn't provide any security, it's readable by any card reader, and it should never be used as the actual card number. So as you're guiding your customers through their purchase decision, watch out for CSN-only readers because they ignore the credential data stored in the secure area of the contactless smart card. The CSN is readable by any reader, so again, it's public. Now, examples we often hear of are MyFair Desfire readers that are, say, not compatible with iClass COS platform from HID. Now, this reader will only read the CSN, which is visible to all, thus ignoring the credential data stored in the secure part of the contactless smart card. Now, malicious people can easily clone or simulate the CSN and bypass all of the security a smart card is supposed to give customers. So thus far, we talked a whole lot about different card technologies, but we haven't really compared them in great detail. So let's go ahead and do that now. But beforehand, do note that there are links embedded in the presentation to expand your learning on specific subjects. So do feel free to click on those links when you do get access to the presentation material. So in this section, we're comparing different card technologies and even looking at the card structure. So let's first start off by comparing 125 kilohertz proximity cards to 13.56 megahertz smart cards. Traditionally, prox cards are said to be less expensive, although this is not so true in many regions anymore. It also has a longer read range because less data is exchanged on the 125 kilohertz range. However, the disadvantage of this technology is that it provides lower security capabilities because the range can't support encryption, making it vulnerable to copying. Additionally, there's no storage capability, so that card couldn't be used for other applications like, say, cashless vending or biometrics and so on. So if your customers want more applications out of their card and a secure credential, you should guide them towards the 13.56 megahertz smart card, as they offer encrypted communication between the card and reader, as well as more storage because there are more bits. That additional storage affords more capabilities like storing a biometric template. Traditionally, smart cards were more expensive, but for the most part, the prices have come down to about the same price range as 125 kilohertz prox cards. Another disadvantage of the smart card is the shorter read range because of the higher volume of data being exchanged and the frequency range. So, since the smart card has clear advantages, we urge you to guide your customers towards this technology. So let's focus more on this subject. To use a metaphor, a smart card is basically an encrypted card with embedded microprocessor and memory similar to a USB stick. In the transaction between the card and the reader, there is more information exchanged between the card and reader because of the higher read range. There are two dominant secure types of smart cards, including HID, iClass COS, and MyFair Desfire. These are the dominant and secure options that we see in the market. Your customers may also ask which to choose, whether they should go with HID or MyFair Desfire, which is manufactured by a company called NXP. So to help give them a balanced response, just note that HID iClass COS has a high adoption in the Americas and uses proprietary encryption keys between the card and reader that is managed by HID. So for customers that don't want to worry about managing their own encryption keys, HID is a great option. We see that MyFair Desfire credentials have a high adoption in EMEA, in Europe, the Middle East, and Africa, as well as parts of APAC and Asia Pacific. And this technology uses this technology enables end users to configure their own encryption keys, giving them more control. So be sure to warn them never to leak or forget these keys. Next, we'll look at how card memory is segmented. So a smart card's memory is structured like a USB stick. It can be segmented with an application running in each compartment called a sector, in the case of MyFair Desfire, or called an application area in the case of HID iClass. So let's take the example of a MyFair card where sector 0 is used as the MyFair application directory, which essentially keeps track of what the remaining sectors of the card are used for. The other sectors are used for the actual card number, your cashless payment for the cafeteria, your library card, and even your biometric template that can consume more than one sector. Now that we've covered the card basics, let's talk more about advanced credentials. So for the next few slides, we'll talk more about biometric technology and mobile credentials in detail. Now, traditionally, authentication used to be about presenting something you know or something you have. Biometric allows your customers to heighten security by asking credential holders for something they are. Now, something you are can include your thumbprint, your facial composition, or your iris. Note that the image in the middle of the screen, that's a biometric swipe card. Upon presentation of the credential holder's thumbprint, will it broadcast the credential when presented to the reader. So the thumbprint essentially activates the credential. It's a quick way for dual authentication without having to upgrade the readers. This is a cost-effective alternative to customers requiring biometric authentication for a small population of credential holders. Now, if your customers are looking for more security, but just for executives or, say, IT staff, this could be a worthwhile solution. Body behavior analytics combined with facial recognition analyzes the way you walk, calculating measurements like your height, your posture, and motion that essentially makes up your unique ID. A vein reader analyzes your palm vein patterns and compares it with the composition stored on file. That picture on the far right is a wearable device that uses electrocardiogram to authenticate credential holders' identity. It turns the person's heartbeat into a unique key that can be used in a variety of applications, including access control. So everybody's got a unique heartbeat. It's based on the size and the shape of your heart and the orientation of your valves. It doesn't change unless you have a major cardiac event. Now, heartbeat credentials are still a futuristic subject, if you ask me, that hasn't seen widespread adoption in our market. Note that for certain countries like France, they have requirements that won't allow a database to be held on the actual device. So biometrics must be on the card in that case. Fingerprint or the biometric template must be held on the smart card, and then the exchange is done between the card and the reader. Now, note that mobile credentials can also be an alternative for users that have a modern smartphone with a thumbprint reader to access the card applications. But let's talk more about mobile credentials on this coming slide. So, here is a projection at the credential market in 2021 according to IHS Markit. You'll notice that about half of the credentials shipped in 2021 will be vulnerable 125 kHz prox cards, whereas the other half will be secure alternatives. Now, we rely on the system integrator community to educate end users of those vulnerabilities. But we'll dive into credential security in the next section. For now, I'd like to direct your attention to the 16% share of mobile credentials. According to IHS, 44 million mobile credentials will be downloaded by 2021, representing the fastest growing segment. Mobile credentials will continue to become more common in the market. IHS estimates that 27% of all readers sold in 2021 will possess the capability of granting access via a mobile device. So imagine a large organization issuing credentials to thousands of cardholders. With physical cards, this process is daunting and most often executed in phases. But with mobile credentials, customers can issue a high volume of credentials more efficiently through the following workflow. Now, the operator first assigns the mobile credential in their cardholder management task of their access control platform that essentially triggers a workflow where the recipient, the actual credential holder, will receive an email. She'll be prompted to download the application of their host software. So in this case, we're looking at the HID Mobile Access application offered by HID. So they'll go ahead and download the application of choice. And once they download their application, they'll be asked to input their activation code, which is found in that email. And as soon as they enter that activation code, the host access control system will be updated with the credential in the database, so they can go ahead and use their credential at their readers. Now, your customers would typically purchase a bulk of mobile credentials from you, and every time a mobile credential is activated, it essentially debits the customer's account. There's also a smartwatch application for certain mobile credential providers where you can gesture from the smartwatch, and that tells the application on the smartphone that is running in the background to connect with the reader and to shake hands. For areas with few doors in a large surface area, some vendors also offer hands-free mode where a credential holder approaches the reader and the door will automatically unlock. This is typically great for hospital applications where doctors can move freely throughout the hospital when they approach a door. Also great for parking applications. When you approach the gate with your car, the Bluetooth-enabled readers can establish communication with the smartphone from up to 2 meters or 6.6 feet away. So no need to roll down your windows. Now, it should make a very important distinction between Bluetooth-enabled readers and NFC-enabled readers. What's the difference, and which should you recommend your customers? The answer is that it depends on who your customers want to cater to. Are credential holders iOS, Android users, or both? Now, Android and Windows Phone users use near-field communication, or NFC, to communicate with the reader, but as the name suggests, it only has a read range of around 10 centimeters or 4 inches. So that wouldn't cater to a variety of long-range applications. Now, iOS phones have an NFC capability, but it is locked down for Apple wallets. So in order to cater to all devices, including iPhone, Android, Windows, and so on, you'd want to guide your customers towards a reader capable of both Bluetooth and NFC. And as the data suggests on the chart, Bluetooth and NFC compatible readers will represent over 80% of the market adoption from now until 2021. Let's talk about the future of mobile credentials. In talking with the big providers of mobile credentials, we envision that we'll eventually move from periodic authentication to continuous authentication, where the access control system will tap into the sensors embedded on your smartphone and smartwatch. Think of an access control system will essentially assess the credential holder's authenticity index based on things like facial recognition from the front-end camera, keystroke recognition, your heartbeat monitor projected by your smart wearable. The moment that the confidence interval dips below a specific threshold, a credential holder may be required to authenticate the old way by providing a password representing a thumb. Now, this is again a futuristic conversation, so I want to come back to earth and talk about credential security. So in this section, we'll start off with factors to bring up with your customers as you coach them through their credential purchase decision. We'll talk about card security levels and best practices for securing credentials, and then we'll even discuss why secure credentials is only half the battle. So you should ask your customers for their risk tolerance to their people and assets if their credentials can be copied. If they want to mitigate this threat, you should walk them through the following considerations. Proximity versus smart card. MyFair and iClass versus Desfire EV1 and iClass CIOS. The DeskFire EV1 and iClass CIOS were more secure. One-factor versus multi-factor authentication, and then open format versus controlled format. So we've covered these topics earlier on in the presentation, and we all agree that smart cards are more secure than 125 kilohertz prox cards, but not all 13.56 megahertz smart cards afford the same security. MyFair Classic has been compromised when MyFair Plus came out, but was later hacked. Then DeskFire 4K came out, and that was later hacked. And now the market has standardized on DeskFire or MyFair DeskFire EV1, which has still not been compromised, but there is even a DeskFire EV2 that is available for when DeskFire EV1 is hacked. So you can sort of see a pattern here of an evolution of credential technologies. Now, if we look at the case of HID, HID's iClass has been hacked. And now there's the iClass CIOS, which is the latest generation that has not been compromised. So, moral of the story is that smart cards are harder to hack because they have security mechanisms, but some are more advanced than others. The goal is to encourage end users to keep up with the most secure credential, continuously adopting the latest that the market has to offer to protect themselves against vulnerabilities. But the card migrations are a tricky undertaking. This is why mobile credentials will be increasingly attractive in the future. No need to reissue new cards when the technology is compromised. To the end user, the application on their smartphone will auto-update with the newest encryption standards or newest patch and remove the vulnerability. This is what makes mobile credentials fundamentally more secure. So let's take a look at different card security levels on the next slide. So here's a simplified representation on encryption standards and how they've evolved over the years. Now recall that prox cards do not offer any encryption because of the limitations in wavelength and storage on the card. So this graph merely shows us where each smart card lies from an encryption point of view. You'll notice that Crypto 1 is a proprietary 48-bit encryption that has been compromised. That's when MyFair evolved to MyFair DeskFire that standardized on a public 56-bit encryption standard called 3DES, which stands for Data Encryption Standard. iClass, which has been hacked, leverages this standard as well. But recall that HID always manages the keys themselves, not the end user, for the case of iClass CIOS. AES is the next iteration, which ranges from 128 to 256-bit public encryption standard that, according to NIST, is unlikely to be hacked for the next 10 years. So you might ask, where does CIOS fit in all this? The answer is only HID knows. CIOS offers an additional layer of security to iClass Classic that consists of encrypting the data on the card. Now, this proprietary encryption can only be decrypted by an HID reader. Finally, we have most evolved encryption standards called RSA, which goes all the way to 2048 bits. MyFair Smart MX leverages this advanced encryption standard. The adoption of Smart MX has been rather low in access control, but higher in smart mobility, consumer interaction, and e-government. So to bring this all together, how do you respond to a customer asking for best practices for a secure credential environment? The answer is that the more secure the better, like in the case of MyFair DeskFire EV1 or 2 and iClass CIOS. When we talk about card security, mobile credentials are as secure as CIOS and DeskFire EV1. Custom encryption keys will also allow your end user to have unique encryption, but they must keep it a secret. If your customer wants absolute control over their encryption keys, then MyFair DeskFire EV1 is a good route. Proprietary encryption keys is convenient as it's out of the box. If your customers don't want to deal with their own encryption keys, then they can rely on HID that takes care of that responsibility. Therefore, iClass CIOS is a good route. Controlled formats limit the chance of duplicate cards to access a secure area. Remember that options do exist like HID Corporate 1000, which is a managed service offered by HID, or HID Elite, which is essentially where readers are paired with cards using a secret handshake. So next we'll talk about why credential security is half the battle. So moving to secure credentials is not enough. The entire architecture must be considered, and I'd like to show that on this slide here. So vulnerabilities can be present at the card level, at the reader level, at the controller level, and even at the workstation, along with everywhere in between. So the next few slides will cover how threats have evolved and how to guide your customers towards a secure approach. So there are a few ways criminals can undermine your access control system from just a physical layer, meaning they can get into your customer's premises with the parts of the system that they can see that are on the outside of the secure area. Now, skimming refers to when a criminal uses his or her own reader to access the credential information without the knowledge or consent of the victim. Relay attacks refers to that criminal cloning that information and putting it on a blank card and using it to gain access to the premises. Finally, tapping refers to when that attacker recovers the data sent between the reader and the controller by undocking the reader from the wall, tapping the wire with an inexpensive device that listens to the credential, thus bypassing all of the security between the credential and reader. This is what we call a Wiegand vulnerability, and it's very present in the market. We'll talk about a secure alternative soon. But first, how did the market respond to these threats? So, as we've seen earlier, there have been a greater adoption of more secure credentials like MyFair Desfire EV1 or iClass CIOS and mobile credentials. These credentials will make up about 50% of the credential market in 2021. Additionally, we've seen reader manufacturers adding sensors in their reader capable of detecting if someone is tampering with the reader. If the reader is undocked, it will sound an alarm for an operator to acknowledge and to address. We also see some vendors adopting more secure protocols and latest encryption standards like OSDP or Open Supervised Device Protocol version 2 over Wiegand and IT standards like TLS 1.2 authenticated encryption between servers and downstream hardware. So the good news is that the market has many alternatives to offer, but it can be confusing to design a secure system with all of these options. So why bother securing your customer's architecture? Your customers should care if they want to mitigate the following risks. The risks of accessing cardholder and credential data for cloning at the physical or logical layer, meaning vulnerabilities in software can permit an attacker from accessing a database of credentials for mass cloning. If that attacker can access your customer's access control server, there are risks of changing access rules to bar entry to premises or by granting the attacker with the necessary access to access highly secure areas. And there are also risks of moving laterally on the network from exposed endpoint to endpoint, accessing and stealing private data on the network. So if your customers want to mitigate these risks, let's jump into where they exist and how we can guide them towards a secure approach. So let's start from left to right. Recall that magstripe and 125 kilohertz prox cards provide identification, but no storage with no encryption. Additionally, the attacker can access the Wiegand wire behind the reader. They can tap the wire with a device that listens to the output given by the controller. So when a green LED is fired, it stores the credential in memory so that the attacker can download or retrieve over Bluetooth. This is possible because Wiegand is one-directional, meaning if the reader is tampered with, the controller is not notified unless it is directly wired to a tamper switch. Wiegand is also unsecure, unencrypted, so despite using a secure credential like iClass CIOS or MyFair Desfire EV1, the sensitive info can be retrieved in clear, simple text over the Wiegand wire. This is also a low throughput. It has low throughput, so it takes much longer to pass the info up to the controller. Now, there lies vulnerabilities at the controller level as well. So ask your customers if there are controllers on the outside of the perimeter, how often is the firmware on these IP controllers updated, and if default passwords have been changed. Additionally, vulnerabilities can exist on the server or at the workstation level. Ask your customers how do users authenticate. Once authenticated, what can they see, what can they do, and how is data hidden from unauthorized users. Now, this first module is about cards and readers, so we'll have more time to cover upstream architecture and other modules. So now we know where the vulnerabilities lie, let's find your customers a secure alternative. So again, starting from left to right, 13.56 megahertz smart cards and mobile credentials are a secure alternative to what we've seen on the previous slide. Note that not all smart cards are the same. Always look for the latest evolution like iClass COS and MyFair Desfire EV1. Mobile credentials are as secure as vendors make them. For the case of HID mobile access, there are multiple layers of security on the mobile device on both Android and iOS, which continuously updates and evolves. The app runs in a dedicated sandbox with sole access and ownership of its data. The encrypted mobile ID is stored in a keychain vault within the sandbox. The vault to protect the mobile ID is tied with the unique keychain ID for that particular device. That is why HID mobile IDs cannot be transferred from phone to phone. It's because they have a one-time bond with the phone once it's assigned. In addition to the security of the mobile operating system, COS signs and decrypts all mobile IDs using AES and uniquely binds the mobile IDs to specific device. The HID Mobile Access app offers an optional setting to ensure that the passcode is entered or a biometric is presented before activating the mobile ID. This therefore serves as a dual-factor authentication. Next, a secure alternative to Weekend is called OSTP version 2, which is the second generation of Open Supervised Device Protocol. OSTP offers significantly more throughput, allowing a greater exchange of information between reader and controller and vice versa. Since it's a bidirectional protocol, the controller can send commands to the reader like LED configuration changes or to deactivate a frequency, which is more efficient than updating each reader individually. OSTP version 2 is encrypted with AES 128-bit encryption, so the tapping vulnerability is eliminated. So now that you've recommended a secure alternative to your customers' cards and reader environment, let's look at some best practices for a migration. So a card and reader migration can be tricky. Your customers will rely on you for their migration suggestions. But first, let's talk about when is a good time to recommend a card and reader migration. So some drivers for newer credentials often occur following a merger or acquisition, or facility consolidation or relocation. Any changes in real estate usually bring up questions on consolidating systems, so before buying the same vulnerable technologies, suggest that they slowly phase in a secure alternative. Even aesthetic changes like a company logo or branding would require mass reprinting. Suggest they move to a secure credential instead of reordering the same technology from the past. Your customers may want to use access cards for different applications like car parking or cashless vending, but cannot with their 125 kHz credential because they don't have storage capabilities. Suggest a smart card capable of storing more information. Your customer's insurance requirements may have changed, or perhaps they can pay a lower premium if they move to a more secure credential. Perhaps there are new legislations or regulation requirements that spark a credential migration conversation. Lastly, and regrettably, end users often consider a card and reader migration following a security breach. So, there are a few ways to go about a credential migration. One option is a brute force migration, which involves a short period of time. All credential holders return their old cards to their badge office or to the reception, and they are immediately granted their new cards. During that transition, the reader must be replaced. This is recommended when business operations are not at peak, like say during the summer for a school. Conversely, this limits the vulnerability the quickest. Now, a phase migration involves replacing all 125 kilohertz readers with multi-tech readers capable of reading both frequencies. Then slowly replace cards department by department. Once all departments are migrated over, you deactivate the 125 kilohertz frequency to remove the vulnerability. Recall that OSDP allows you to send a command to all readers to deactivate the prox frequency. Conversely, the same migration can be used with multi-tech cards. You'd replace all cards with multi-tech cards and then slowly replace all readers. This approach is less likely to interrupt business function or operations. Be careful that your customers should not use multi-tech readers and credentials together. It's one or the other. Now recall that 125 kilohertz frequency will be read first because of the longer read range. So if a multi-tech card is presented to a multi-tech reader, the reader will always pick up the 125 kilohertz frequency before the 13.56 megahertz frequency. Multi-tech cards and readers are generally more expensive than standard cards and readers, so price may be a factor in your customer's decision. For customers migrating to mobile credentials, the process involves adding a Bluetooth or NFC component to your existing readers. These readers will usually read both 13.56 megahertz smart cards and mobile credentials. Then distributing the mobile credential are a breeze, as it can be done directly from the access control system interface that we've seen on a previous slide. So that takes us to the end of Module 1. Today we discussed different forms of credentials like cards to pins to biometrics. We looked at older technologies and newer credential technologies. We walked through how cards and readers work, the relationship between cards and readers. We talked about the data on the card, like card formats, the CSN, and the card structure. We even compared credential technologies in greater detail and focused in on biometrics and mobile credentials. We then shifted gears and talked about emerging threats to an access control system and discovered that it's not enough to just have secure credentials, it's about securing the entire architecture. And finally, we ended off with card migration best practices. So what to expect for the next several weeks. This concludes Module 1 of 6. Next week, we'll be talking about controllers and electronic locks in greater detail. So at this time, I'd now like to take us into question and answers. I remind you to please use the question dialog box located at the right-hand side of your screen to submit your questions so that Francois and I can take an answer. We'll be on mute for a couple of minutes to review your questions, and then we'll come back online to respond to them all together.